U.S. President Donald Trump is once again the disruptor at a G7 summit in Canada. He's also once again muddied the outlook on Canada-U.S. trade. Trump has left the summit.
It was intended to be a demonstration of strength, a strategic move to reestablish global leadership. Instead, Donald Trump may have just delivered Canada its most significant diplomatic triumph in decades, and he had no idea it was coming. Cameras captured what appeared to be progress during the G7 summit. President Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney shaking hands firmly. The two men agreed to work toward a new trade agreement within a month. Smiles were shared, flashbulbs popped. However, behind the scenes, trouble was already developing. Tariffs had been increasing. Trump imposed a 25% tax on Canadian energy, timber, and aluminum, devastating crucial industries and torching decades of peaceful economic cooperation. However, it wasn't Ottawa that blinked. It was Boston, Vermont, New York, and Maine. As governors saw their economies deteriorate, tourism dwindling, businesses collapsing, and jobs disappearing, they took action. Canada responded quietly and efficiently. This is the story of how a calm northern neighbor pushed the American economy to its knees without firing a single shot. How Trump's attempt to penalize Canada triggered a rebellion within his own borders. Between Boston and Ottawa, the unthinkable occurred. I lost to Canada? Yes, Mr. President, you did. It all started with a dazzling, forceful handshake that meant nothing. At the G7 conference, President Donald Trump stood alongside Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, showing unity as they announced plans to pursue a new trade agreement within a month. It was the type of moment Trump enjoyed, cameras flashing, headlines flying, and the appearance of power. But beneath that perfectly prepared photo op, the machinery of economic disaster had already begun to grind. While Trump grinned for the cameras, governors in the northeastern United States were already raising the alarm. His decision to raise duties on Canadian imports, 25% on lumber, aluminum, and energy, was not just a setback for Canada. It was an economic earthquake in his own country. New England's economy is strongly linked to Canada's. American homes are built with lumber from Quebec. Aluminum from Ontario is used to fill American beer cans. Energy travels south from Canadian plants to illuminate American cities. And the people, they cross borders as neighbors, not rivals. So when Trump launched his trade war, it didn't just affect Ottawa. It exploded in states such as Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, where governors saw tourism plummet, hotels empty, and small businesses panic. And as Trump ridiculed Canada, calling Carney a glorified governor and joking about annexing the country as the 51st state, the impact was already very personal. Canadian tourists have ceased arriving. Canadian dollars have stopped flowing. Canadian trust has disappeared. The handshake might have appeared diplomatic, but it meant nothing. While Washington conducted a raucous trade war, New England quietly staged its own resistance. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey has seen enough. Her state's tourism business was failing. Flights from Canada were drying up. Hotels were reporting massive cancellations. And the border villages that previously thrived on Canadian foot traffic had gone strangely silent. Instead of waiting for Washington to come to its senses, Healey decided to take action. She did not go to Washington, D.C. She traveled to Boston. In a historic and extremely significant gesture, she convened an emergency conference of fellow governors from New York, Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine, rather than diplomats or White House aides. On the opposite side of the table, Canadian provincial officials were as frantic for answers. There are no cameras. There are no press releases. Only urgency. The organization posed a simple question. How can we defend our local businesses as the federal government drags us into a trade war with our closest ally? And the answer was just as bold. Do it ourselves. Governors and premiers considered forming direct energy cooperation to avoid federal constraints. They proposed tourism packages to entice Canadians back and infrastructure initiatives to connect cross-border towns. They even contemplated appealing for exceptions to keep importing crucial components such as Canadian lumber and aluminum. It was a stunning moment, state leaders taking on tasks typically designated for national governments. Trump intended to hurt Canada. Instead, he sparked an uprising among his own people. An uprising motivated by economic survival, rather than political grandstanding or protests. It was quiet, deliberate, and very un-Trumpian. In that Boston boardroom, the insurrection had begun, with governors opting for cooperation over anarchy, diplomacy over divide. What's the message? If Washington does not lead, the states will. For President Trump, tariffs were just numbers. 25% here, 30% there. But they weren't numbers to the folks who live along the US-Canada border. They provided a means of survival. And when the trade war broke out, politicians were not the ones who suffered. It was everyone else. Sterling Morse, a hotelier in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, a coastal hamlet long popular with Canadian families, stood in an empty lobby, staring at a silent reservation book. Last year, his inn was crowded with French-Canadian guests. Same family weeks and rooms. What about this year? Nothing. 90% of his Canadian clients had disappeared. They're angry, Morse remarked quietly. And they're not coming. He opened a dusty box containing last year's guest cards, each marked with a miniature Canadian flag. What about this year's box? Empty. This doesn't pay the bills, he said quietly. This doesn't work. And Morse was not alone. Across the country, Canadian snowbirds, retirees such as Gary and Carol Cruz, began canceling their annual winter visits to Florida and Arizona. For years, they spent up to $30,000 each year in the United States, sleeping in RV parks, shopping locally, and supporting eateries and businesses. But now, they felt betrayed. We used to love America, Gary explained. But what about this? It's like a slap from your best friend. Their RV remained dormant in Ontario. Their Disney visits were canceled. What about their Made in the USA loyalty? Gone. Now, says Carol, if we see a US label, we put it back on the shelf. Tourism boards in Florida, California, and New York hurried to launch desperate ad campaigns titled, "We're not Trump, still your neighbors." But it did not work, because the harm was not only political, but also emotional. For real people, waiters on Cape Cod, small merchants in Vermont, and innkeepers in Maine, this was not a trade policy discussion. It was about surviving. And each day that the border remained calm, each Canadian traveler who stayed at home served as another reminder of a war that no one wanted. It wasn't simply about tariffs. It was about trust, and the confidence was gone. The tariff war did not simply affect travelers and hotels. It ripped through entire businesses like a shockwave. And nowhere was the effect more unexpected or destructive than in locations where most Americans never anticipated to suffer. Take beer as an example. Massachusetts has one of the nation's major craft brewing sectors. The industry was thriving, from little tap rooms in the Berkshires to world-class breweries in Boston, until the aluminum tariffs were imposed. Almost every craft brewer uses Canadian aluminum for their cans. And when the price skyrocketed overnight, the effects were severe. "We've had to lay off staff," revealed one brewery owner. "Production is down, and we have pallets of beer that we can't ship. The cans are more expensive than the beer inside. Warehouses full of unsold inventory. Distribution chains froze. The layoffs spread to drivers, packers, marketers, and bartenders. All were casualties of a war that no one on the ground selected. Then came the housing crisis. Affordable home projects in New England came to a halt when Canadian lumber prices skyrocketed. Developers who had previously erected hundreds of units every year abruptly suspended construction. "We can't afford to build," one contractor explained. "The math just doesn't work." And the spiral did not end there. Trump's tariffs on Canadian power and natural gas caused energy rates to rise across borders. A Massachusetts analysis projected a $2.5 billion increase in heating and utility bills over the next 5 years. That is not politics. It is anguish for working people struggling to keep the lights on. Even Republican governors started speaking out. It wasn't about party loyalty anymore. It was about economic survival. Rural hospitals were forced to close owing to declining revenue. Schools' budgets were frozen. And yet, there was silence from Washington. The message from the ground was deafening. Trump's tariffs did not penalize Canada. They were punishing Americans. And every beer not sold, every house not built, and every job lost demonstrated that this economic war was out of control. While Trump blustered and projected machismo, Canada did something different. It strategized. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not respond with insults or threats. He did not make fiery press conferences or launch Twitter tirades. Instead, he moved inside, emphasizing stability, partnerships, and long-term diplomacy. And silently, it worked. Canada launched targeted economic measures, not to provoke, but to apply pressure. Key U.S. exports were hammered with retaliatory tariffs, which were especially targeted at politically vulnerable regions. Maple syrup, untouched. Wisconsin cheese, taxed. It was not personal. It was precise. However, the most powerful action occurred without a single sanction. Canada told its citizens to stay at home. Tourism ads shifted toward Discover Canada. Domestic travel soared. Canadians were encouraged to spend their money within their own borders. And they did. Beaches, ski resorts, and national parks all experienced record surges. The money that previously streamed into the United States remained north. And while the United States panicked, Canada stayed cool. Meanwhile, overseas, French President Emmanuel Macron moved to strengthen connections with China, establishing trade deals, boosting energy contracts, and fighting for European economic independence from the US. America, once the heart of global trade, was watching as the world moved on. For many Canadians, it was not about politics, but about dignity. "We're not trying to hurt anyone," a Canadian business owner stated. "But we won't be insulted and still show up with our wallets." Canada did not shout. It just walked away. And the silence, it spoke louder than anything Trump has ever tweeted. In the end, Donald Trump's swaggering trade war resulted in a quiet, obvious defeat. The tariffs did not devastate Canada. They galvanized it. And while Trump ridiculed leaders, hiked taxes on daily items, and dubbed economic hardship patriotic, the people who suffered the consequences were not in Ottawa. They resided in Maine, Massachusetts, Florida, and Arizona. They were hotel clerks, bartenders, beer brewers, and retirees who previously considered America their second home. What about the genuine rebellion? It was not in Canada. It was in Boston boardrooms, cross-border rail meetings, and governors' offices that state leaders dared to act when the White House refused. Trump wants to appear strong. Instead, he alienated allies, angered neighbors, and sparked the economic protests in his own backyard. And although he laughed about making Canada the 51st state, the United States suddenly appeared small, reactive, unpredictable, and unprepared. Because trade conflicts are not won by tweets. They're disoriented by deserted motels, rising power bills, and pallets of unsold alcohol. So when Trump mocked, "I lost to Canada," the response came not from politicians, but from the people. "Yes, Mr. President, you didn't only lose to Canada, you also lost America's trust."